What if the meeting of world leaders in Washington on August 18th didn't end the way the media reported it? On Monday, the cameras showed world leaders smiling and shaking hands. But just imagine what could unfold if President Trump, behind closed doors, had secretly made a deal that brought China into the arrangement. Join us on the first in a new series of recent history videos, exploring how bypassing NATO and drawing China into a security guarantee for Ukraine could transform the war overnight. The meeting that changed nothing. Or did it? On the surface, the Washington summit ended with no breakthrough. Trump, Zelenskyy, and the European leaders left the White House without a ceasefire. Only vague promises of further talks and, as the president himself put it, good meetings and maybe great meetings. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if, behind closed doors, Trump brokered a deal that no cameras caught? A deal that bypassed NATO and made China into the key player in Ukraine's future. The Hidden Pact. In this alternate history timeline, Trump offers Zelenskyy a radical security guarantee. Not through NATO, but through a joint US-China framework. The logic was simple. Europe was too divided, NATO too slow, and Trump too eager for what he would no doubt brand the greatest peace deal in history. The terms? America and China would jointly guarantee Ukraine's borders. The US and China formally pledged to respond if the country's borders are violated again. Washington stations rapid reaction forces in Poland and Romania, with Beijing contributing peacekeepers or observers inside Ukraine. In exchange, Kyiv would grant China access to reconstruction contracts and trade routes, and NATO would be left in the dark until the pact was already in motion. The immediate fallout and NATO's response. Ukraine, desperate for survival, agrees in principle, but when European leaders discover the deal, fury erupts. Macron accuses Trump of attempting to dismantle NATO from within. Starmer warns of a new Yalta, a division of Europe decided by outsiders. Putin, instead of splitting the West, suddenly faces an unexpected Sino-American axis. When NATO learns of the secret Sino-American pact, it leads to instant outrage in Brussels. The organization's leaders feel sidelined and humiliated. For more than 3 years, they've carried the main burden of military aid to Ukraine, only to learn that Trump has cut a secret deal that excludes them. Mark Rutte attends an emergency meeting at NATO HQ, where he and his colleagues demand answers, express diplomatic outrage, and quietly panic that Washington has just undercut the alliance's credibility. Macron and Meloni would quickly go public, blasting the pact as a betrayal. The UK under Starmer might play the role of the calm critic, warning that NATO can't survive if its most powerful member freelances with authoritarian rivals. Eastern European states such as Poland and the Baltics would be furious, fearing abandonment. They'd double down on their own defense spending and start whispering about forming parallel European defense structures. In Warsaw and Riga, officials quietly ask the unthinkable question: if America won't stand for Ukraine, will it honor Article 5? All this said, NATO itself couldn't expel the US, but the pact would gut its unity. And behind the scenes, talk of strategic autonomy, that is to say, Europe building independent defense structures, would go into overdrive. A world reordered. The ripple effects spread like shockwaves across the globe. China gains an unprecedented foothold in Eastern Europe. Formerly just a silent economic partner, it now acts as a self-proclaimed peace broker. Beijing sets up a permanent reconstruction office in Kyiv, draped in Chinese flags and Belt and Road banners. For the first time in modern history, Chinese officials walk the streets of Europe as arbiters of war and peace. Europe finds itself humiliated and sidelined. The EU's carefully crafted defense plan looks like irrelevant paperwork next to what President Trump is calling the greatest deal of the century. Leaders quietly admit that Europe's security guarantees are no longer worth the paper they're printed on. Talk of strategic autonomy isn't just chatter anymore. Brussels drafts the blueprints for a European army. Russia reels from the betrayal. Moscow had expected China's silent support. Instead, Beijing stands shoulder to shoulder with Washington. Kremlin hardliners accuse Putin of losing Ukraine twice, once to the West and again to China. In the streets, whispers of discontent grow louder, feeding speculation of palace intrigue and coups. And on the battlefield itself, the war mutates. It no longer resembles the grinding stalemate of 2022 to 25. Instead, Ukraine's front lines become bargaining chips in a great power poker game. Every village, every river crossing, every trench is suddenly less about military advantage and more about what Trump can announce as tremendous progress in his next press conference. The old order, NATO in the west, Russia in the east, is gone. In its place emerges a new and unstable balance, a US-China axis presiding uneasily over Europe's future. The long-term consequences. By 2026, Ukraine is no longer simply a country at war. It is the world's most contested, protected state, a nation split between competing patrons. Its skyline tells the story, half rebuilt with Chinese loans and state-owned construction projects, half bristling with American weapons, Patriot batteries, and Abrams tanks stationed at key crossings. For ordinary Ukrainians, survival means living under two shadows. Reconstruction funds arrive from Beijing, but at the cost of economic dependency. Entire sectors of Ukrainian industry are effectively leased to Chinese corporations. American support flows in too, but always tied to military demands, training, and deployments. Ukraine's sovereignty is preserved, but only on paper. In reality, it is tethered to two rival powers with competing visions of its future. Europe, meanwhile, drifts. Once the driving force behind Ukraine's defense, Brussels now struggles to find relevance. Macron pleads for strategic autonomy, but divisions between Eastern and Western Europe deepen. The Baltics and Poland pour money into their armies, convinced they may be next to stand alone. Germany, cautious and dependent on stability, hesitates. NATO cohesion frays as allies quietly ask the unthinkable. If Washington can abandon NATO for China today, what stops it from abandoning Article 5 tomorrow? For Russia, the consequences are devastating. Cut out of the new security order, isolated from both East and West, Moscow finds itself cornered. Whispers of coup plots and succession battles grow louder. Hardliners demand escalation, while moderates argue for rapprochement. Neither side finds a solution. The once vaunted special military operation has become a trap for the Kremlin itself, bleeding legitimacy with every passing month. Globally, the US-China pact unleashes forces no one can fully control. Washington touts it as the greatest peace achievement of the century. Beijing sells it as proof of China's rise as a global stabilizer. But what was designed to secure peace instead births a new Cold War. This time, the lines are drawn differently, not East versus West, but America and China in an uneasy partnership against a Europe left adrift and a Russia in freefall. The world enters 2026 not safer, but more fragile. Old alliances crumble, new dependencies form, and at the center of it all sits Ukraine. Not merely a battlefield, but the prize in a dangerous experiment of great power bargaining. Conclusion. History will remember the August 2025 summit as indecisive, but in this alternate timeline, a hidden deal in the Oval Office reshapes global order, raising a haunting question. What if survival forced Ukraine to trade Europe's unity for an unlikely pact between its greatest ally and one of its greatest rivals? Would such a bargain have brought peace, or doomed the continent to a new age of uncertainty? If you want yet more speculative permutations of recent history to chew on whilst you wait for real shifts to come, subscribe to Alt History Zone for updates on what could have been, and what could still be. Stay tuned!